Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Sitting down with the originators of equine therapy. You guys deny it, but I'm going with it. So how did you start to realize it? Were you getting some feedback from some of your friends, or was it kind of your idea to get these Vietnam veterans around horses, or how did it start?
At that time was when I went up to Centennial Racetrack, and I started hanging out with a fella up there cleaning stalls. I was watching him clean stalls. We were talking horses, and that turned out to be Audie Murphy. And so then I really realized that here was a World War II most decorated soldier, and his sanctuary was in the shed row at the barn, cleaning the stalls and taking care of his horses.
Yeah.
That was it. And so then I started getting an idea that these soldiers really found peace being around the horses.
Billy Jack and Anne Barrett, how are you guys doing today?
Good.
Fantastic.
Well, I appreciate you guys taking the time and opening up your beautiful home to me and the Veterans Voice podcast to interview you guys, share some resources about equine therapy. I was telling you guys a little bit about what the purpose of the podcast is. It's essentially to spread resources for veterans, but along the way, share the stories of the awesome people involved. And I've been wanting to do an equine therapy episode for a few months at this point, and I feel like I'm sitting down with the originators of equine therapy. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys.
Well, we're excited to share it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's pretty neat.
Well, Billy Jack, Anne, let's just go back in time and cover how you guys met. When's the last time you talked about that?
Well, the first time we met, I was delivering a horse with a Vietnam veteran. We were hauling horses across the United States and pulled into Meredith Manor. And this had been in the late 1970s. And I told the fellow, I said, well, so we normally don't drop a horse off in the middle of the night, but I'll call ahead and tell them we'll be outside the gate. I called ahead, and the lady said, well, I'm up doing barn check, bring the horse in. So we did. And I made a comment as we unloaded the horse, I've never seen Meredith Manor. The lady said, well, I'm doing barn check, and if you can keep up, I'll give you a quick tour.
Yeah.
And she was pregnant at the time, and I thought, me keep up? Come on. And so anyway, after we finished unloading the horse and got in the truck and headed down the road, I told my sidekick, his name was Wesley P. Stephen, and I told him, I said, boy, if that lady wasn't pregnant, I'd have tried to talk her in the truck going back to Colorado with us. And years later,
it worked out.
We met out in Colorado, and here we are.
So you met again later on.
Yep.
Okay. What was your first impression of him?
What in the world are these guys doing delivering a horse at 2:30 in the morning? And I had to wake up. We had barn check, and students had to help. So I had to go wake up the students. And so we went through 8 barns, I think. We had quite a few horses.
Okay.
And unloaded the horse that he brought. I even remember the horse. It was a black thoroughbred. And got it settled in and gave him a tour of the place, and off they went, and promptly forgot about it. I think I was probably, at the time, it was 1979, and you dropped off the horse in June or July. And I gave birth in August to my daughter.
Okay.
So I was a little pregnant.
Yeah. Wow. That's a beautiful story. That was a long time ago.
Yeah.
And you guys are still together. How many years has it been?
Well, we've been together 36 years.
Wow. That's inspirational for sure. Well, Billy Jack, let's go back to 1966 when you were drafted into the Army. Tell me about that.
I got drafted in 1966, and at that time, we were all watching the draft board, and I thought I was way at the back of the drawer and wasn't expecting that, but I wound up going through basic training at Fort Hood. And then I had gone through my basic training in AIT, and then I was blessed to go through the NCO Academy, and I'd had been kind of on the fast track, and I came down on a government orders for Vietnam. And then in setting it on my duffel bag at Travis Air Force Base after doing all the processing, I made a comment to a fellow sitting with me, it'd be nice if we were flying standby and we'd get bumped off that flight. And about that time, they came over the loudspeaker and said, Barrett, Billy Jack, US 5438-3960, report to the control room with your bag and baggage. Do not board the plane. And I got pulled off orders because of serious drug allergies. And after I went through a program at Letterman General Hospital, they were going to put me out of the military on a medical, and I refused to be a shirker. I said, I'd rather go to Nam and take my chances than to be known as a shirker. So they said, well, we'll see if we can't find a job in the continental United States. And that's what brought me to Fort Carson to the 4th and 12th Cavalry in 1966. So that was pretty good duty.
Yeah. So you were immediately into the horse buying business for the 4th and 12th Cavalry out of Fort Carson?
Yes.
How was that job?
And, well, it was quite interesting because at that time, a lot of veterans were coming back from Vietnam, and they would get drunk and tear up the barracks or go to town and get in trouble. And at that time, they just put them on the shelf until they processed them out. And a lot of them, they would send down to Fort Carson to be in the horse platoon until they were processed out of the military. So at that time, I started realizing that there was benefit in being around horses. These fellows that were getting in a lot of trouble were no longer getting in trouble, and they found peace in the sanctuary working with the horses in the program. And so that was the beginning of my being aware of horses and people.
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying. Sitting down with the originators of equine therapy. You guys deny it, but I'm going with it. So how did you start to realize it? Were you getting some feedback from some of your friends, or was it kind of your idea to get these Vietnam veterans around horses, or how did it start?
No, really, it was at that time, they were just sending them down there. Mm-hmm. And then in hanging out with these fellows that were having a lot of troubles, they were having nightmares, and they realized that being out around the barn and being around the horses, they were doing a lot better. And at that time in buying horses for the government, fellow Jack Gaylor and he was a civilian ranch manager, but we would travel throughout Colorado buying horses for the program. And then as some of the horses had come up lame or weren't suitable for the program, we'd take them to the auctions and sell them. But just working with many veterans and seeing how they had found a sanctuary at the barn. At that time was when I went up to Centennial Racetrack, and I started hanging out with a fellow up there cleaning stalls. I was watching him clean stalls. We were talking horses, and that turned out to be Audie Murphy. And so then I really realized that here was a World War II most decorated soldier, and his sanctuary was in the shed row at the barn, cleaning the stalls and taking care of his horses. Yeah, that was it. And so then I started getting an idea that these soldiers really found peace being around the horses.
Yeah. Yeah. We were talking before we started recording. I was going to ask you about Audie Murphy later in the interview, but let's get into it a little bit right now. I told you in the Army, I did the Sergeant Audie Murphy Club. It's a series of board type interviews. And I was inducted into Audie Murphy Club. But tell me what it was like being around Audie Murphy in person. Because I only know his biography and his whole story, but I can't imagine meeting the legend that he was.
Well, the thing that was interesting is that he and I had a passion for the same bloodline of horses. And that's what really brought us together. And at that time, we never talked about World War II. And it was just the camaraderie and the bonding that we had, talking about horses and the people that we knew. And he had bred to this famous stallion in Arizona by the name of Spotted Bull, and that was a horse that I really liked. And so I talked about how one day I wanted to own a son of Spotted Bull. And so really, Audie and I just talked about the horses, and that was really about it. But then that was his sanctuary around the barn, and the people were very respectful when they came around the barn. They didn't bother Audie, and he appreciated that.
Yeah, so you kind of saw it in him that he was getting this therapeutic effect from being around horses as well.
Later, when I put two and two together, I saw that was the benefit. And then after I got out of the service in 1968, I went back to Texas for a short time. Then I came back to Colorado in late 69. And I had brought some nice horses back. And I was looking for a horse that Audie Murphy had told me about, a horse named Bull Run that he had raised. And we'd lost track of that horse, and that was before computers and telephones we have today, and trying to track down a match racehorse somewhere was difficult. But also at that time in the early 70s, I had a fella call me up, and he said, I'm looking for a good horse, and I heard you had good horses. And I said, well, you're welcome to come down and look. And he said, well, my name's A.P. Clark. I'll come down to see you. So A.P. Clark came down on the ranch, and we started riding horses together, and I showed him a couple of horses that I had. And I could tell he was probably retired military. He had high-top brown boots and khaki riding uniform. And it was a little bit later, I found out that A.P. Clark was the superintendent of the Airforce Academy, and he was the fellow that in the movie The Great Escape.
Okay.
So here's A.P. Clark, and his sanctuary is also on the back of the horse.
Mm-hmm.
And so at that time, I started realizing that a lot of the military folks on their own had never heard about equine therapy, but they found their peace there.
Mm-hmm.
And then being across from Fort Carson on Highway 115, I had a lot of veterans that would just go hiking out in the woods, and they'd be hiking across the ranch, and I'd invite them to help dig post holes or fix fence or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had a lot of veterans volunteering to help out on the ranch just because they found a sanctuary there.
Right. Yeah. Back then, I don't think PTSD was really a label. You know, people kind of said they had shell shock or something like that. But it sounds like you guys were treating PTSD symptoms without actually knowing it. And then once it started to get traction, we'll ask Anne here in a minute about like the science behind it all. But this is where it really started. It was post-Vietnam, and it was the passion that ranchers were having for horses like Audie Murphy, like yourself. And then the veterans were coming in and getting healed inadvertently. It was just a symptom of it sounded like.
Well, that time the common term was just battle fatigue.
Battle fatigue.
And then there were veterans that showed up on my doorstep that really had been through the battle, been through the war. And there was one fellow, James Timothy Lee. Then I would have to say James Timothy Lee and Audie Murphy and A.P. Clark were three of the ones that really instilled in me the calling to try to be helpful to veterans through the horses.
Yeah. Okay. Wow. I'm just trying to think back in time. This was so long ago. And for this kind of stuff, I would argue, you know, those Vietnam veterans were seeing some of the wildest stuff. You know, I was in Afghanistan. A lot of my buddies were in Iraq, but I don't think the times compared. I don't think the war experiences really compared to what was going on back then, just because of the technology differences. We were, you know, riding around in, you know, multi-ton vehicles that were armored to the teeth. And I've interviewed, you know, Charlie Watkins, and he tells me he was flying around in a in a helicopter with the doors open, shooting out of the window. And it's just completely different times. But to hear that these guys were healing through equine is just really, really refreshing. But yeah, tell me some more. Maybe there was an individual back then that you just really resonated with that was really inspiring. Do you remember any?
Well, when Fort Carson opened up Turkey Creek Ranch, that's an old historic horse ranch south of the main installation. And there were actually World War II veterans that still came out and rode their horses daily.
Wow.
There was a Colonel Prunty that had been in the Cavalry, and he was well into his mid-late 80s at that time. And what he did when he went out for a ride by himself, he would tell me which trail he went in case the horse came back without him.
Oh, man.
But that old gentleman, he rode probably average of at least 5 times a week. And but just being around those soldiers at that time, these guys that were troublemakers on base were great hands around the farm and the ranch. There were just too many people to single anyone out. There was a fellow today that might be a good interview if you catch up with him. He was Command Sergeant Major Sonny Clark, and he served multiple tours in Vietnam, and then he was the Command Sergeant Major at Fort Carson. And when he came to Fort Carson, he brought his horse with him, and we developed a relationship because that was his peace of mind to get horseback.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
MACKY Steinhoff.
Well, and yeah, that's quite a bit later in the story, but
Yeah.
then
But it's as powerful.
Yeah.
after I went to, well, it was a lark that I wound up there, Force Academy. in 1980, I'd been raising horses in Colorado, and I had a lot of veterans that would come over to the ranch and hang out. And in 1980, I was watching Johnny Carson one night, and the phone rang. A fella asked me, he said, "Billy Jack Barrett?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I apologize for calling so late, but would you be interested in running the horse program at the Air Force Academy?" At that time, I had a lot going on. My response was, "Well, not no, but hell no." And he said, "Well, why not?" And I said, "Well, Kenneth, I don't have time to put up with a bunch of colonels' wives and their fifi horses." And he said, "Well, you hit the nail on the head." He said, "The Air Force Academy inherited a horse ranch when they bought the land for the Air Force Academy, and it's currently the riding stables." And he said, "These women have to understand the Air Force Academy has a higher priority than to provide a place for them to keep a horse."
Right.
And he said, "We've been thinking about shutting the program down, and I was advised to maybe find a professional horseman to run the program." And he said, I asked around town, your name kept surfacing. And so I took the liberty to give you a call this evening. And I said, "Well, what do you do out there, Kenneth?" I said, "You run recreation services?" He said, "That's under my umbrella." I said, "Do you oversee the human resources and do the hiring and firing?" He said, "Well, that too's under my umbrella." He said, "Because the Air Force Academy is a university, my title is superintendent." And I thought, well, Kenneth, if you're the superintendent, you've got 3 stars. And are you losing sleep over the stables? He said, "I am." And I said, "Well, I had a friend that in the early 70s that used to be running the academy. His name was A.P. Clark." He said, "Well, A.P. Clark told me to call you." So he was kind of reeling me in. Yeah. So I said, "Well, I'll come out the next day and talk to you." So I went out the next day and talked to him and Colonel Charlie Coble. And I told them I'd take the job on as a volunteer. And they said, "Well, it's a government position and a volunteer can't do a government position." So I said, "Okay, I'll take the job for a while." Well, that was God leading me down a path that I had not planned. And that's where I met a lot of people, including General Johannes Steinhoff. He was, at the time of his death in the mid-90s, he was a leading fighter pilot for all nations and ace fighter pilot. He had twice been decorated by Hitler. He was in the coup that also tried to kill Hitler. And then after the war, he was chief of staff of the German Air Force. And then he was on the
chairman of NATO.
He was chairman of NATO.
Okay.
And he actually, his daughter had married Senator Mike Byrd in Colorado Springs. So General Steinhoff would spend 6 months each year in Colorado Springs, and most of that time during the day he'd spend out at the stables horseback riding or helping around the barn. Mm-hmm. And so General Steinhoff, his story is quite interesting. He'd been shot down 12 times. 4 times he had to parachute out. 13th time he was taken off. He was the first commander of jet aircraft in combat. He was taken off with a load of ammunition, had a blowout, careened into a concrete bunker, and the plane exploded. He spent the last year and a half in burn clinics. But he was badly burned, badly scarred. But he spent a lot of time there at the stables, and we spent hours and days horseback riding, and it was just a real blessing. And this is a story that I've been told it should have been written down. But Anne was managing a big horse farm south of Colorado Springs owned by a man by the name of Cyrus Rickles. And Cyrus Rickles, too, was World War II vet, but that's all we knew about him. And one day I'd taken General Steinhoff, and his nickname was MACKY. So I'll just refer to General Steinhoff as MACKY. But MACKY told me one day, he said, "Hey, I heard Anne had a really nice Grand Prix warm blood down there, Damon." I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, I'd really like to see your wife's horse sometime." So I said, "Okay." So I took him down to the barn one day, And we spent the time looking at the horse. And then a couple of days later, I get a phone call from Cyrus Rickles, the owner of the farm. He said, "Hey, Billy Jack," he said, "I heard you had General Steinhoff out at the barn." And I said, "Yes." He said, "That is one man I would really like to meet." And I told him, I said, "Well, we're going to go on a ride Friday, so won't you come join us?" So I said, "Well, I don't ride anymore, but why don't you schedule or reserve a table at the officers club, and we'll come buy you lunch on Friday." I said, "Okay." So after Mackie and I finished our ride on Friday and we got back and put our horses up, he had on his German riding attire, which was the high top boots and the khaki uniform. And then he carried a riding crop that he had just carried like cavalry officers did. And so anyway, we met Cyrus Rickles in the parking lot there, and I introduced the two, and Cy drove his big gold Mercedes and chauffeured us up to the officers club. Upon arrival at the officers club, that place was packed. There was not a parking spot anywhere. I mean, there was no room anywhere. And then I saw right in front of the officers club was a reserved parking spot, said reserved for chief of staff. So I told Cy, I said, "Cy, just park there." So we whipped that big gold Mercedes in there. And as we got out, a major came running from the officer club front door, and he ran up to me and said, "Excuse me, but you just parked in the chief of staff's parking spot." I said, "That's correct, Major. I want you to meet the retired chief of staff of the German Air Force, General Steinhoff."
Wow.
And so that major clicked his heels and saluted, and Mackie returned the salute with his riding crop. The major ran to the officer club door and opened the doors for the three of us to enter. And as we entered the door, the Air Force Academy Officers Club, and went in, it was during the lunch hour. And as the lady met us and escorted us in, at the very first table was General Milton and General A.P. Clark, seated with other generals. And this was what they call the Corona Conference, where they brought all the general officers together for meetings at the Air Force Academy. And when this is not military protocol, but when even at the dinner table, when A.P. Clark and General Milton saw General Steinhoff enter the building, these two generals pushed their chairs back and stood up at attention. And a wave went up across the entire officers club. There were probably, I think that officers club seated about 600 people. And so then here were all these generals and officers standing at attention. And General Milton and General Clark came over, and they were also riding buddies, and they exchanged pleasantries. And I introduced them to Cy Rickles, and they commented they'd rather been out horseback riding with us than attending the meetings. And so then the three of us were taken by Karen, the lady that was the officer club manager, over to the table reserved. And it was one of these little bar room tables with high stools over by the bar. And she said, "This be fine." He said, "You bet." So as we sat down, then the rest of the club sat back down and continued the meal. Well, Cyrus Rickles and Mackie started talking, and Mackie, General Steinhoff, asked Cy, he said, "Well, tell me about yourself." And so Cy told him that he had been born to a very wealthy family in Texas, oil family, and his passion was flying airplanes. And as a teenage boy, he had his own airplane. When World War II came along, he went to join the military and to fly, and his father had so much political pull and connection that he prevented Cy from getting in the military. So Cy explained that he bought a one-way ticket to England and joined the 5th Royal Air Force. And so then Mackie and Cy are talking, and then Mackie asked Cy, he said, "Well, where were you stationed?" And Cy explained that he was flying off the English islands. And he started telling the story. And Mackie held up his hand for him to stop. And then he took a napkin, and on the napkin, he drew 12 airplanes sitting in a line. And then at the foot of the L would be 6 airplanes. And MACKY said, we came in, we flew in, and we took out the 12. And the 6 got in the air behind us. And then these two men start staring at each other. And so MACKY told him, he said, I know I've seen those eyes before. And so these two old gentlemen are sitting there realizing that they were in a dogfight in World War II. And then MACKY explained to me, he said, at that time, we flew by the seat of our pants. And so I said, yes, said, from the gunfire, there was so much smoke in the cabins, you couldn't read the gauges, and half the time they didn't work. So MACKY and Cy continued talking about being in this dogfight with each other. And then Cy told MACKY, he said, well, I knew I had one shot left, so I was coming in at you, and I took the shot, and I missed. And MACKY said, yes. I turned around and flew back at you, and Cy said, you saluted me and flew away.
Holy smokes.
And these two old World War II veterans are sitting there with just tears flooding down their face. And MACKY said, one professional pilot to another.
Wow. What a story.
Yeah.
How did you feel being there when that was going down?
Oh, yes. I was just sitting there dumbfounded. I mean, it's like all the activity in the Officers Club was just in the fog somewhere, but
Right.
it was just the three of us sitting at that small table. And then these two men were men's men. And I mean, just tears were rolling down their faces as they remembered that.
Man, what a story. Holy smokes. Jeez. I'm just trying to picture this right now. Whenever I hear stories like that, like real in-depth, intricate stories, I like to try and put myself in the moment. I'm just imagining these two soldiers going at it like that. Wow. Thanks for sharing that. That should be written down, but we just recorded it, so that kind of counts.
And MACKY spent probably 5 hours a day at the stables or more. And some days we'd take off and go horseback up in the mountains all day. And he shared a lot. And I remember one day I noticed he had been out in the barn for quite a while, and I thought I'd better go check on him. So I went out in the barn, and the horse that he had his arms that he rode all the time was an Appaloosa gelding ex-race horse named Pine Hill Scamp. And when I went by the stall where the horse was, MACKY was standing there in front of the horse with both arms up around the horse's neck and his head buried in the horse's shoulder. And I stood there for a minute. And then when MACKY realized I was there, he turned around and I could see he had tears. I said, MACKY, you okay? He said, yeah. He said, I'm just a foolish old man. He said, I've got to be leaving to go back to Germany. And I'd heard some of the staff talking about this horse is not ridden by too many people. And I know you've got to run a business, make money, and you'll probably be taking the horse to an auction. And I said, no, MACKY. I said, this horse earns his keep. He'll be here till he lives out his years. And I kept the horse there until he expired of old age, and then we buried him there on the Airforce Academy.
So it was kind of MACKY's horse?
That was a horse he fell in love with. And he was quite a horseman. And also, President Reagan had a passion for horses and rode Appaloosas. And so anyhow, one day MACKY came in and told me, he said, I'm going to have to cancel our trail ride on next Thursday. And I said, how come? What's more important than our trail ride? He said, well, President Reagan wants to see me in the Oval Office. So
that counts.
I took I had pictures of Pine Hill Scamp winning horse races back when he was a racehorse. And I gave those pictures to MACKY. I said, well, here, Reagan likes Appaloosas. And I said, I'd met Reagan once before, but take him these pictures and show him. Mm-hmm. So when MACKY returned from his trip to the White House, he said, oh, yeah. He said, I took the pictures out and I showed President Reagan, said, this is the horse I ride at the Air Force Academy. And Reagan looked at it and said, well, that's Appaloosa racehorse. He said, well, he used to be, but now his second career, he's a saddle horse and trail horse at the Air Force Academy. And my friend Billy Jack knew you liked Appaloosa, so he gave me the picture to show you. And so Reagan said, I knew a tall, skinny Texan named Billy Jack that delivered horses for Hank Schulte. And he said, I used to get some of my horses from Hank Schulte at the Hillcrest Appaloosa Ranch in Texas. It's that tall, skinny Texan Billy Jack delivered the horses. Mackie said, well, that was the same Billy Jack.
Wow, man.
So that's pretty cool to have Mackie sit there and use my barn stable phone to call President Reagan.
Yeah, absolutely. Wow. Well, Anne, I want to get into your story a little bit. So my whole intention was kind of asking you about like where you started, both in the Vietnam days and then after that into the Air Force academies. I just want to like figure out where this equine therapy idea started, like you guys were doing it back then, but maybe it didn't have a label. So, and where were you in these days, like 1966, moving on into like early days into equine?
Well, I was raised in Alaska, but I had a passion for horses. So my folks got me a horse. When I left Alaska, I went to Meredith Manor because I knew I wanted to make my livelihood with horses. And at that time, it was the leading horsemanship school in the country, probably one of the few. And so I went there and I worked my way through Meredith Manor, got my degrees, graduated in 73 from there and stayed on as staff, senior staff, and became the senior dressage instructor and showed courses competitively on the East Coast with Kay Meredith. And that's where I really developed a passion for the training part of it and dealing with difficult horses that other people had given up on. The horse that Bill delivered, the black thoroughbred, was a situation of this horse has to be reclaimed or he can't be used. Mm-hmm. He'll have to be euthanized. And so we were able to reclaim him. So I learned a lot there. But I don't know that equine therapy was something I ever thought about until I moved back to California. I started working with young riders, took some young riders for the Region 5 from California to back east for the North American Young Rider Championships, which involved regions of the United States as well as Canada and Mexico. The first year I took a team back east. We went to Illinois. Our first time there, and it was a real learning experience for young riders. And these are 16 to 21-year-olds that the United States Dressage Federation was looking at, the United States Equestrian Team looking at as possible team riders once they reached adulthood after their 20s. The next year we went, we won the gold for the entire competition in dressage. So it was my passion was training horses and then working with kids. Mm-hmm. Well, when I moved out here to Colorado and got together with Bill and we got married, he had warriors. At that time, there was a gentleman that had made his career was the military and had just gotten out and was just really lost. He didn't know what to do. So he lived with us. And that was my first introduction to seeing somebody from war. My dad was one of Carlson's raiders in World War II, and he survived it. And so I knew I didn't know it was shell shock or anything. I just thought my dad was driven. And his expectations were very high. And we worked hard. And it was just this focus that was almost a bit abnormal. Mm-hmm. I mean, so focused. Obsessive yeah. kind of a thing. And so I just thought that was normal. Well, then watching this friend of Bill's that I became a friend of mine as he was out of the military, and I started to see that his sanctuary was horses too, and didn't really stop to think about it until we started working with kids from the foster care system. And it wasn't that we wanted to do that. It's just that we were introduced to two children who needed parents. They needed a family. And it was through our church, through a child psychiatrist whose land we had leased for our horses. And with those kids and the traumas that they had been through, and then working with the child psychologist and the psychiatrist, they started to realize that there's some real major issues going on. PTSD was something that was just being labeled. It was just having scientific proof that there was a physiological as well as an emotional and a mental effect there. So it was something that then it was put into the journal that the American Psychiatric Association has. So it was finally PTSD. It took a lot of work and campaigning by people to get that done.
What year would you say that was?
That was probably, I want to say when PTSD became called that and recognized, that was probably 30 years ago.
Okay.
I lose track
90s.
of time, maybe even a little bit later. I want to maybe the mid-90s, a little bit earlier than that, maybe. And so with these kids, the psychologists were looking at the fact that the trauma they had gone through was when their brains were forming, as opposed to an adult whose brain has pretty much formed except for the final development of the frontal cortex. But these kids, PTSD was just part of it. So now they're trying to come up with a determination, a classification for these children that they're seeing in the foster care system that have suffered sudden terrible physical abuse, head injuries, trauma, losses, all of this together. So in talking to the therapist with the kids, I was really interested in that, because trying to figure out how you take these children that are so hurt, their souls are hurt, how do we actually heal them and not use medications? A lot of these kids in the foster care system, because of behavioral issues, are on medications. So the first thing the child psychiatrist did with us was we took them, as we adopted these kids, we were then able to take them off of all medications, find a baseline, and then go from there and treat depression and treat head injuries and treat these different things. But because we had horses, we found these kids coming along probably exponentially fast compared to kids that weren't in the same situation. So, and that was just because we had them as a business. And then with what Bill had found and seen, we realized the benefits of horses. So prior to adopting kids, we had volunteered through our church with Dale House. And Dale House is a home in Colorado Springs. It's a Christian-based home that is set up for kids between, 18 is when they age out of the system, and I think they can go to Dale House at 16 when they're wards of the state. They've got one foot in the Department of Corrections. They don't quite know what to do with them. So Dale House takes the kids. They try to get them their GEDs, teach them about finances, teach them about work, have them save up money so they can have a first month's rent on an apartment. They get them ready to emancipate. And so they started bringing the kids out to the ranch. And every Saturday they would come out. It was because there was one counselor that loved horses. Yeah. And she would come out and we'd have her ride horses and just whatever she wanted to do. And so she said, wow, I'd like to bring these kids out. So we started working with the Dale House, and out they came. And it was amazing. Teenage boys and girls, kids in gangs. I mean, kids, their stories were just horrific. And watching them with the horses, moving hay, fixing fence, halter breaking babies. We had one that the baby was not successful living, and one of the kids was bound and determined he was going to hold that baby up and have it nursed, and he was willing it to live, and he had to learn to let it go. So they went through losses and they went everything, and we always ended each Saturday with milk and cookies, like you would do for a little kid. Mm-hmm. And they would sit around and talk about their dreams. And that was just mind-blowing. It was the most wonderful time when we saw what these horses. We even had one of the young men from Dale House that had earned a privilege to be able to be gone on a Saturday, and they weren't coming out that particular Saturday. We lived out in Black Forest, and Dale House is downtown Colorado Springs, and I looked up, and his mom had hitchhiked the two of them out so he could show her the horses. This was a gang member. This was a kid that was really good at running drugs and being the head of the gang. I mean, he was good, and here he was out there with his mom to show them the horses. So we saw what an effect it had. We used him on our kids. And then as Bill was at the academy and he was seeing more and more of a need for that, is when we really thought he put together the program, and he can tell you about that. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there was a gentleman that worked with, up in Larkspur, the home.
Yeah, and that was Greg Kirsten. He worked with the Emily Griffith Center.
Yeah.
And it was a home for delinquent teenage boys. And Greg and I had met before, but he was in Vietnam, and he was a dog handler. And he was, not only did he know dogs, but he knew horses. And then I don't know if his title was just a counselor, but he oversaw this group of delinquent boys at the Little Horse Farm, the Emily Griffith Center. And he's felt that actually the individual that coined the EGALA, the founder of EGALA, which is Equine Assisted Learning as we know it today.
Well, Greg, when he got back from Vietnam, he saw the problems, and he was a cowboy and raised around horses. And he looked at the issues of the trauma. And he thought, he's seeing veterans coming home and they're being hypervigilant. They can't incorporate well back into society. Things, sounds, noises, set them off. Their relationships are imploding. Nothing is working. And he thought about it for a while, and he wanted to pick an animal that was a prey animal. He didn't use dogs because dogs are predators. But even though our warriors, we don't think of them as prey, they're warriors, but they are also being hunted.
Yeah.
And so he looked at horses, an animal that was domesticated, that showed how to live in a society. And so if you look at wild horses, and he based his training on the reactions of wild horses, when you see them in a group, if they have some sort of stimuli that happens, they will leave a distance away. They don't flat run pell-mell panicked and go. They go at a safe distance, they turn and look at it, and they evaluate it. Depending on what they evaluate, they might come back and circle around it, explore it a little bit. Plus, they learn to live in a herd where they watch each other's backs, and they take care of the babies. How is it that wild horses survive mountain lions and things like that? Well, they have a social structure that's very interesting to watch. And so that's what Greg patterned his OK Corral series over, is how do you respond to stress? How do you respond to stimuli? Evaluate it, decide what can be avoided, what needs to be addressed, what needs to be gone around, what can be gone through, and so that you form a cohesive, working together society. And he incorporated that into the OK Corral series, which is what Bill implemented at the Airforce Academy, because he realized with this program that he needed to have a legitimacy to it with trained facilitators. So it's not therapy. He does have a program that's equine-assisted psychotherapy for therapists, but the main one is equine-assisted learning, where the horses are actually the therapists, the people that are helping you are the facilitators, and then the individual does the work based on what the horses react and show to them. And I don't know if you want to get into the physiology behind it yet.
Absolutely. I was going to ask, let's get into, I'd read a little bit about heart math and how you guys use that in equine therapy or equine assisted recovery. Let's get into the science and physiology.
Yes. There's, in the beginning, people, actually Hippocrates, when was he in the 400s BC or something like that? He has a chapter to healing health. And it is natural remedies, and horses is one of them.
Okay.
So he actually saw the benefit of horses back then. And it's so over the years it's come, and there's been different countries that have recognized it first, that there's healing with horses. So it actually started in the 1960s with hippotherapy, which is taking physically handicapped people and putting them on the back of a horse, and the motion of the horse as it walks and the swaying of the hips does something to the body as well as to the speech.
And this is called
hippotherapy. So this had to do more with physical disabilities. So people with cerebral palsy and MS and things like that, where, and usually it's bareback because the warmth of the horse too, and then you can feel the motion. And so as the horse walks and its hips sway, it actually loosens up parts of the body. which affects the brain. And so they saw, well, this really works. Kids with, and I've seen it happen with cerebral palsy that get off. A kid from Iran came over and was going through this hippotherapy at an equestrian center where I worked. And he would get off from riding and he was walking straight. This kid eventually graduated to jumping horses.
Wow.
And he had cerebral palsy. It was amazing, crippled up before he got on, and what it did to his body. So they could record actual physical benefits from this. And so then when that happens, the doctors prescribe it, the insurance pays for it, just like when PTSD gets recognized and is legitimate. Mm-hmm. You can use it in court, in law,
Sure.
all that kind of stuff. So then nobody addressed the emotional healing until we see these warriors from Vietnam. And this is what Greg Kirsten was trying to do, is address in these kids the emotional trauma. So in studying it, and I would say 7-8 years ago, there was only a couple of universities studying this. Colorado State University.
Even that recently.
Was one of them. Yes, it's just been very recent where they've said, they call it, this is magical. It's a mystical and magical.
Sure.
And somebody said, hey, let's find out what it does, because it's obviously doing something. So CSU set up the Temple Grandin Center. They built that whole new facility right by the where they have the Western Stock Show. And they started studying what does it feel physiologically that happens to a person that affects their emotions. And so many universities have gotten on board to the extent that now, years later, you can pull up universities that offer these programs. Mm-hmm. They offer how to teach them. They offer, Mississippi State University has a stress therapy equine course for students prior to finals so that they can go through that and hopefully have less stress taking their finals. So it's quite interesting.
That's genius.
It is genius. What they have found is that the heart and the brain are unbelievably tied together and linked. Now, we think of our heart as just pumping blood. And I have a daughter who's a cardiology nurse, and she said, no, Mom, the heart has its own brain. And I'm going, the heart has its own brain.
Fill me in.
Yeah, it has a nervous system. And I'm not a cardiologist, so I'm going to keep this really simple because I'm sure a cardiologist could really get into the heart better than me. But it has neurotransmitters. It sends information to the brain. The brain releases hormones based on that. So when we talk about our emotions, we usually point to our heart. When we love somebody, when we make expressions of love and gratitude, we tend to touch our chest. Well, that's the center of our emotional being, our soul. And yet it's just an organ that pumps blood, but it's not. It is amazingly intelligent. And so based on the communication it has with the brain, it sends these signals. And these signals then translate into chemicals being released, which is hormones. So if we're going through stress, cortisol is released, and that's a stress hormone. Some of these heart math, some of these other programs, research, have tested the amount of cortisol in the horse's mouth when they're interacting with really nervous, frightened people.
Is it elevated?
Yes.
Okay.
It is. Now, what's interesting is HeartMath did a study where they took 8 individuals. They took 8 horses, totally separate. They hooked up a heart monitor to each individual, well, one at a time, but to the individual, and they hooked up a heart monitor to the horse. Now, our hearts are the size of a fist. They weigh maybe 10 ounces. A horse's heart is the size of a large melon.
Wow.
And so, it can weigh anywhere from 10 to 15 pounds. It's heavy. Mm-hmm. So it's much bigger. We have an electromagnetic field around us that goes 5 to 8 feet out from us. A horse has 9 times that because he's got a bigger heart.
It's coming from the heart.
Yes. So his field is so large that when we approach, we step into that field. So when they hooked up the heart monitors to these 2, they were monitoring, and I'm not familiar, I just know the EKG that blips when I go in to have my heart checked. But apparently there's 4 different areas that they could monitor a rhythm or whatever. And when they had the person in a building and the horse in the arena, they each had separate, no relationship at all. they put the person in the arena in a chair with a horse just wandering around. Again, separate, no relationship. Then they caught the horse and they had the person take their hands, not touch the horse, but start to scan it close. Within 30 seconds, the human's rhythm, all four, were pulled into the heart's rhythm, all four. They corresponded. You now have heart coherence.
Holy cow.
There's a connect. The horse did that. So the horses have that ability to change the rhythm of our hearts, to change the secretion of those hormones. And so we get dopamine, we get endorphins, the serotonin, you hear all this stuff. That's the love hormone, the feel-good hormone. This is what working with horses does. When a person is hypervigilant, like our warriors, when they come back, their minds are racing, their hearts are racing, they're in a state of hypervigilance, and the amygdala is really active. And that has to calm down for everything to translate into rational thought, problem solving, relationships, social skills. So by doing the horse therapy, with what we do, we see a change in the heart rates. We see the relaxation. The chest relaxes. They almost become a little bit peaceful. Horses don't lie. They don't judge. They don't hold a grudge unless they've been terribly abused.
Mm-hmm.
They have a memory more than anything.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask you about that. Yeah. Could an abused horse have an adverse reaction to this?
We have found that sometimes abused horses are the most empathetic. If you can call a horse empathetic, they are. We've seen cases with the foundation that Bill had set up out at the academy, Bill and Jeanne, of a horse, really hurting person that's not going to talk to anybody, that's carrying a tremendous load of a warrior that's come back. And one of the most difficult horses that doesn't like other horses, doesn't like people, will bring herself out of the herd and come up to that individual on their own and put her head in their chest. There's something about that draws her to the really, really hurting ones.
Interesting.
So we use mares because they're the body of the herd. They're the ones that take care of the babies. They're the ones, the stallion runs around and makes babies, but they're the worker bees behind the scene, Okay. So we use the mares in a herd situation. And so there's different levels of comprehension. There's different levels of coherence between the heart and the brain with each individual. It changes depending on whether or not they really give into it, mm-hmm. or they're trying to fight it. They're trying to make an impression. The best are the people that have never been around horses. Mm-hmm. People that have been around horses tend to resort back to their horse training,
okay.
Yeah.
I see.
So it's better. But in this study that they did of the 8 people, 7 of them, it happened in all 7 cases. 1 case it did not. But in 7 of the cases.
Wow. That's amazing.
It is. And
I haven't personally interacted with many horses in my life. I think I did like one guided mm-hmm. through the Garden of the Gods once. Mm-hmm. That's my only interaction with horses. So I don't fully understand, but hearing this is amazing.
It's done on the ground. I know there's people that are really afraid. And I think that there was one person that came that was very afraid. And so therapy was done. Mm-hmm. Jeanne did it in a different way because the fear was too great.
Right.
But there's not riding until later if they want to. Yeah. It's done in a relationship on the ground. So
what does that look like? Let's just walk through it. Let's say we have a veteran listening, mm-hmm. just like me. He's never been around horses. Yep. What does an equine therapy session look like?
It starts out with being handed a halter and said, this is how it works. There's the horses, go pick one.
What's a halter?
A halter is what you put on the horse to catch it.
Okay.
Yes, doesn't have a bit in its mouth. It's what it wears when you catch them and lead them around. And so there it is. There's the horses, pick one. And then the question is, as they go out, and it doesn't matter how long it takes, and sometimes the horses are cooperative and sometimes they're not. And you see, the question is, why did you pick that horse? And the answers reveal a lot. Because that horse stood away from everybody else. And that's how I feel. And I don't want to be around anybody else. Okay. So it's questions. It's a lot of questions. It starts with catching them. It starts with brushing them. Something as simple as horses love to be brushed in certain areas and they don't in others. Can you pick that out? Is there a little body movement? Is there a little flinch? Is there whatever? But just the act of taking a brush and just brushing, it's almost like fly fishing. You're just that motion. It's constant. Nothing changes. It's the same with the brush. And so we find relaxation that comes with that. It's like, and then their mind, they start to think about them and the horse, what's happening.
Yeah.
And it goes from there. Then it gets more, as the sessions go on, it's more revealing. Today you're angry. Why is the horse not wanting to stay with you? I wouldn't want people to stay with me either.
Yeah.
It's a self-revelation. It's like looking in a mirror.
Yeah. I've talked to people who have done it, and I have this one buddy who's an advocate of it. He's been doing it for a couple of years at this point, but he tells me if he shows up anxious, or maybe he just had a family tension between, like right before coming there, like the horse wants nothing to do with him. He's like, it thinks I'm sick or something. Because it can feel that. And when you're explaining this electromagnetic field, because their hearts are 15 pounds and ours are only, little over half a pound. That's part of the healing process as well. But it would make sense that the horse would kind of deny you that serenity, that peaceful environment, if you were in a rough place.
There's so many really interesting cases. And I think one of the really fascinating ones is when you have units would come out and they would have had a suicide within the unit at Fort Carson or Schriever, one of there. And so there's this horrible, it's no longer a unit. It's been disrupted. It's been torn apart. And there's all the different feelings of guilt, shame. I could have done something. I didn't do something. Why didn't I say something? Why didn't I see something? You get all that. We all go through that. And to watch a group being worked with that starts out with take all of the obstacles that you see in the arena here and build me how you're feeling as a unit. Use anything you want. And they build something that there's no way through it. If they could have built on bigger and bigger, there's no way around it or over it. It's this thing. At the end of the day, it's build me something that shows me as a unit how you feel. And there's always an opening as they process. So it's processing the pain and processing the trauma and not having to tell the story over and over again like you would do in a therapist's office. That just, for a lot of people, is not beneficial. But having an animal that relates to you and you realize that another really fun exercise that is done is when they put all kinds of obstacles in the arena and tell the person to lead the horse past those obstacles. Okay, well, some horses don't like flapping plastic. So in life, do you really have to go over the flapping plastic? Okay. What's flapping plastic in your life?
Yeah.
Why not go around it? And then there's the grain. The horses love the grain. What's grain to you? Yeah, go there. So it teaches you to evaluate and say, and I know with warriors, it's we have been taught, we have trained, we're not going to let anything get in our way. Whatever obstacle it is, we're going through it. We're going to overcome it. We're going to go through it. Well, when you're healing, that doesn't work. There are obstacles you need to stay away from and recognizing that. And it's okay. And learning it's okay, just like the horse. I wouldn't go across flapping plastic if I was a horse either.
Yeah, absolutely.
So they teach you, they're a reflection. We call them a mirror. So more universities are offering this. They're offering, some are offering just animal therapies where they are using dogs and other animals for people that maybe equine therapy doesn't resonate with.
Yeah, okay.
USAA is celebrating over 100 years of service to our military community. In 1922, it was a group of soldiers that started USAA to insure each other's vehicles when no one else would. Since then, USAA has grown to over 13 million members strong, and through it all, one thing has remained. USAA is still serving the military community and their families. With their launch of Face the Fight Coalition to counter veteran suicide, we are proud to have USAA as a sponsor of the Veterans Voice podcast.
Well, let's get into some of the work at the Airforce Academy then. This was a phone call where you offered to volunteer, and it turned into almost a 40-year career. How did you guys kind of combine these two ideas into, this Airforce Academy equine therapy?
Well, before I answer that, something that came to mind while Anne was talking. I recently was talking to M.D. Marks, that's head of the Audie Murphy Research Foundation, and she was sharing with me that in discussion with Audie's son Terry, and then Audie's sister had told M.D. Marks that when Audie was a little boy, his father had left the family, and so Audie was responsible for providing food for all of his siblings. But she said because her little house was so crowded that Audie would go out and get on the big workhorse out in the barn, get on it, sit on it backwards and lay down. And that's where Audie slept.
Yeah.
And so I'm sitting and thinking that's that coming into fruition of what we're seeing today. But that was one of his favorite places to sleep.
Probably the most
was on the
comfortable
back
place.
of an old workhorse out in the corral.
Yeah.
And that was as a little child. And then later on, his sanctuary with the horses later.
Mm-hmm.
But your question about the academy, we actually, in the late 80s is when we had a lot of these veterans that were coming around and hanging around out there. And then it was there was a situation where there was a fella that had come back from a trail ride, and I got to visit with him, and I said, "How was your ride?" And he said, "Oh, it's beautiful." He said, "When I have time off, this is where I like to come and ride." And I said, "Well, how come I don't see you more often?" And he said, "Well, my job is too demanding, and seldom do I get a time off to come do this. But this is just, I feel better when I've been on the horse for a few hours." And so he said, "I sure wish I could bring my staff out here." And he said, this would be great for them to experience this. And so we talked for a little while, and I asked him what he did. Well, he was down at Fort Carson, and I believe he was a hospital commander at the time, but he told me he had a staff of 17. And he said, even though they're highly intelligent people, they're under so much stress, they're really at each other's throat all the time. He said, "I just wish they could experience this." And so I shared with him, and I told him, I said, "Well, Tuesdays are our slow days out here. The horses are shod, and they're standing around the barn. So if you want to bring your team out here for a team building exercise, why don't you bring them out?" He said, "Well, we don't have any money in the coffers for that." I said, "Well, if y'all volunteer to help me check fence and check trails," I said, "that's part of my responsibility to check the fence and check the trails. And I can take whatever volunteers with me I wish." So he brought, I think the first time he brought 17 people out, and we went out for trail ride, and beautiful day. And he called the pizza and had pizza delivered to the meeting room, and they sat and had a wonderful time and ate pizza together. And he called back a couple of days later, and he told me, he said, he said, "That is absolutely the best team building exercise we've ever found." And he said, the military pays for some high dollar deals that really don't work.
Yeah.
But he said, this was fantastic. And I said, "Well, just keep bringing them out." And he said, "Well," he said, "we got to do that." But he said, "We've had people in the office ready to just cut each other's throat, and now they're happily getting along together."
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the beginning of.
So how did you see it progress over your time there, spent almost 40 years?
Well, Jeanne Springer worked there in the office also, and then she had some experience previously before coming to the academy and working with hippotherapy. So anyway, we were encouraged actually by the superintendent. Stopped me one day and told me that he had heard what we had done, and he said, "Keep checking fence."
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the way we began doing that. And then we had some pushback from the academy. They said, "Well, you're using government horses, and they're supposed to be making money." I said, "Well, they are," but I said those are down times, and so they're helping me check fence and fix trails. And then we had a fella that was a fellow by the name of A.J. Scabandy. He had witnessed one time one of the bureaucrats chewing me out for providing free service. And when the fellow left, Mr. Scabandy just came over and on the hood of the pickup wrote out a check for $10,000.
There you go.
He said, you put that in the coffer, and anytime you see anybody that needs to ride a horse that can afford to, you just take it out of those coffers. So Jeanne Springer and I had gotten together and got to talking. And then we realized, too, that we had to have people educated in equine assisted learning. So that's when I picked up the phone and called Greg Kirsten. And Greg was doing seminars around the country. And I talked to Greg, and we needed $15,000 for him to come spend a week and train staff. And so I called DeForest Hamilton that worked with Boeing, and he was familiar with what we were doing. So Boeing donated $15,000 for us to bring Greg Kirsten in for the first seminar. And I believe that was about 2010, I believe, 2009, 2010. But that was kind of the beginning, because then once the Airforce Academy looked at the program, we had quite a few programs there. We had the boarding stables. We had the cadet rodeo team, the cadet equestrian team. We had riding lessons. And then in addition to that, we developed what we call the Warrior Wellness Program. And so it was 2014. We were encouraged by the Chief of Staff at that time, General Mark Welch, to develop a program officially. And then he suggested that since the Airforce Academy is a university, that you can go ahead and develop a 501c3 nonprofit, which became the Remount Foundation, with a memorandum of agreement to continue operating the program from the Equestrian Center there at the Airforce Academy.
Okay, so that became the Remount Foundation. Yes. Okay, wow. What a progression. So today, where's the Remount Foundation?
Well, the Remount Foundation, let me start by explaining the name. Mm-hmm. When Teddy Roosevelt was upset with Indians outrunning his cavalry on Indians riding starving barefoot Appaloosas, he was working with, his aide was named Henry Leonard. He was a Marine lieutenant colonel or major at the time. But Major Leonard and Teddy Roosevelt got to talking, and just like today, they're trying to raise better, faster airplanes. At that time, they were trying to breed and raise better, faster horses. So Teddy Roosevelt sent Henry Leonard to England, and he brought back a dozen royally bred thoroughbreds, and they started scattering them out around the country. And one of those horses, Henry Leonard, brought to Colorado Springs, and his ranch is what is now the Airforce Academy. And they were breeding and raising horses for the cavalry. And that program established by President Roosevelt was a U.S. Army remount service.
Okay.
And so for years, they were riding horses into battle, and now they're riding horses into healing. Mm-hmm. So I thought that'd be a good name for our program.
Yeah, I like it. It's also like you get bucked off a horse. What do? You remount, kind of like bet. A story for life, you know? I'm sure you guys thought of that. That's what I got from it.
Yeah. So anyway, the Remount Foundation has been operating. I think it was officially set up as a 501 in 2015. And they've been taking care of, the patrons are primarily veterans from all branches of the military. We've had quite a few Vietnam veterans, and then since then. And so what's interesting, a lot of the veterans that have gone through the program are now the volunteers.
Right.
And that's really been a real blessing.
And what was your involvement with the Remount Foundation?
I was a cheerleader.
Probably the most important job.
Yeah, go.
But just understanding like the science and physiology behind it all, I'm just curious how you were involved.
Well, I realized that I am not ever going to make a good facilitator, because I don't have the temperament for it or the personality for it. It takes special people to be facilitators. I'm too much of a horse trainer. I want to fix problems. And in the equine therapy, the person fixes their own problems.
Right.
So, but I wanted to be an advocate for the program. So I decided that speaking would be something that we could do. I'd be an ambassador, and wherever I go, I have my cards. I talk to people. I don't go anywhere that somehow equine therapy doesn't come up. And the one thing I really like about Greg Kirsten's OK Corral, he gears it for families. He gears it for kids. It's a lot the same way of doing things, but it's with a little bit different slant. So when he works with the therapists, where they're doing equine-assisted psychotherapy, is different than when he works with equine-assisted learning training facilitators. One of the things we found with the warriors is so much today of riding horses is insurance-related and put a hard hat on, and everybody wants to be covered in case there's an issue. These warriors won't do that. That's an insult. They've been out fighting wars. They've been getting shot at. And putting a helmet on to get on the back of a horse is not going to work.
Right.
And so we try to keep their dignity. You know, those that want to can, if they've had previous head injuries and the doctors, they wear helmets for stuff, okay, well, it's up to them. So we try to give them their dignity at the same time that they're getting into some really deep emotional issues that they're carrying around. And with warriors, it's showing weakness is not an option.
Understandable.
But in order to heal,
You have to.
you have to. And so to heal the right way, to be able to process, to look at, to make the decisions, you're your own advocate for your healing. And so that's why we go with the OK Corral series, because it doesn't require helmets. It has the really good facilitating, whereas some of the others, that's how it is. One of the things that I would like to see more, though, of is hippotherapy in Remount, because there are some people, and we ran into a very dear friend who had broken his legs a couple places, and was an elderly gentleman and wanted to get back on horses, but his balance was off. So hippotherapy would work in a situation like that, where it's very carefully, where he's being led around at first until he's gotten back into the groove of things. That's a hard place if you've ridden horses to be at, where you have to have somebody lead you around.
Right.
But I think that's an area that we need to explore a little bit more.
Expand into.
Right.
Okay.
So it's not just the emotional healing, but it's also, we can get into a lot of the physical healing too.
Okay. How hard would it be for you guys to transition into that?
You know, I'm not sure. We have the ramps and everything. It'd be something. I come up with ideas and throw them out there. I want the kids
Ideas,
in Remount.
execution.
Exactly. Because kids are a big thing for me.
Yeah.
A lot of the kids that I've talked with feel left out because mom and dad are different, and they're going to do this stuff, but they want to keep the kids from that kind of detail and so forth. So the kids feel like, as children do, that they're part of the problem when they're not, and they're not being able to help, and they feel kind of helpless.
Yeah.
And so for me, I mean, I throw this out there to them. I want to see kids training service dogs. They can do that with a good handler. Kids can learn they're part of the solution. Then I want to have an ice cream sundae bar.
Yeah.
You know, so I look at where there's holes that need to be filled, because there's such a huge demand in equine assisted learning. And what Remount does is part of the pie. They have tools, heart math. We hadn't talked about heart math.
Yeah.
Heart math is very interesting. They've been around for over 30 years, and it's researchers, and they're looking at the heart and what in the world is this incredible organ that we have. And it's a series of breathing techniques to bring heart rate down, to refocus thinking. And so it's very beneficial. So that's one piece of the toolbox. Then there is Horseboy, which has to do with autism, and some of that can be used in equine-assisted learning. So what Remount has done that's been effective is added tools to the toolbox.
Okay.
And sometimes equine therapy is just being out there building fence, moving hay, fixing a truck that's broken. It's the background work that goes into everything. Vaccinating horses. There's all different areas.
Yeah. Just
So
having
we've
a
had
job, having purpose.
having purpose,
Yeah.
right?
Well, you mentioned kids and we're talking about purpose. Do you mind if we dive into your guys' Hope and Home Foundation, kind of the history of that?
Yes.
That's a very inspiring story, so I'd love to hear about it.
It was Hope and Home is a child placement agency, a Christian child placement agency here in El Paso County. And back in, boy, I lose track of time in the years.
You
Seems
guys
like
have been through a lot of it.
yesterday, when we adopted our first two out of the foster care system, they were brother and sister. And they were in the mental hospital at Cleo Wallace. And Dr. George Cresswell was their child psychiatrist. And he called up Bill one day and said, I have a young boy that needs a mentor. And Bill said, oh, great, I'll help you find one. And so we started going and checking Dusty out of the mental hospital and spending time with him. His younger sister was also there, and there was a lady from church that was taking her to church. And there was a bunch of events that kind of overlapped and combined to where we realized that God was calling us to adopt these two children together. And Daphne at the time, I want to say, was 8 years old. And she told Dr. George that she did not know how to live in a family, that she needed a practice. She didn't know what that meant, so she needed to practice. So he coined the term practice family. So when he thought, okay, let's form an organization that this isn't about placing children. They're not foster homes anymore. They're practice families. You practice living. And through the church, people that are called by God to do this. And that's what happened. So based on what Daphne had told Dr. George, this 8-year-old child, that she needed, then we sat down one day around our kitchen table and said, what does this look like? And brought out incorporation papers, and Hope and Home was born. But and Dr. George credits Daphne as being the founder of Hope and Home.
Wow.
When she was talking about a practice family, she said, I need to practice having a forever home.
Right.
And so we look back, and you hear that term used a lot in animals and children and everything.
Forever family, forever home.
But the first time we ever heard of that was when Daphne talked about, I need to practice having a forever home. And so then Hope and Home kind of coined that phrase. We're looking for forever homes for these children.
Right.
And that was one of the things with the children. We explained to the 5 children that we adopted that, okay, the practice run is over with. This is now your forever home.
Yeah.
And we actually had a ceremony at the church similar to like a wedding ceremony where we did the adoption, and the children understood that this is not another practice run in a foster home, because I think the 5 that we adopted, I think the average had been in 12 to 13 placements.
Oh, wow.
And they were considered the difficult of the difficult at Cleo Wallace.
Yes, I forgot about that. We did a ceremony at church before it ever was legal. And then eventually, so the kids would say, well, the ceremony at church, we're theirs now. Their name is Barret. So when Dusty had to go in for some minor surgery, he said, Mom, they got the wrong name. It's not saying Barret. And I said, well, they're just, the legal part's a little slow. You're Barret.
That's inspiring. So tell me a little bit about them. How did you guys end up with like the unadoptable batch, and how did you guys inspire them and enable them to turn their lives around and then call you guys a forever home? I want to get to know them a little bit.
Well, Dr. Cresswell had called about Dusty. That was the first one. And I volunteered as, well, I'll help you look for one. And then it didn't take long for me to realize that wasn't what he was talking about. So I would go down to Cleo Wallace, which is the home here south of Colorado Springs on Nevada. I'd go down there and take a lariat rope, and I'd go down in the afternoons and spend a little time with Dusty. And then after they'd done the checking out credentials and everything, I could go down and sign him out for the day, and I'd pick him up in the morning, and I'd take him with me to the Airforce Academy. And I had this late, that was one of the beautiful things about the position I had there, that it was a lot of families there at the Equestrian Center. So Dusty would hang out there and go riding with us. And it was at that time when I'd be waiting on the people to do the paperwork so I could take him for the day, there was this little Mexican boy there that'd say, "Hey, cowboy, I'm Dusty's friend. Can I go too?" And I'd say, "Oh, no." I said, "They'll only let me take one." And he said, "Well, I'm Dusty's friend. You take me too." And so I'd come home and I was telling Anne about that. And, but anyway, I'd gotten where I'd regularly take Dusty several days a week with me to the Air Force Academy, then take him back, check him in. This little Mexican boy was always there and wanting to go too. Mm-hmm. And so one time Anne had to go down to pick up, and actually we'd started taking Dusty and Daphne. So this little guy saw that. He thought, "Wait a minute, he can only take one, but he's taking two." And I said, "Yeah, but they're brother and sisters." He said, "Well, I'm their friend. You take me too." And so I was telling Anne about that. So anyway, Anne went down to check out Dusty and Daphne, and the little guy goes up and said, "Hey, lady, you the cowboy's wife?" She told him yes. And so he started tugging at her heartstrings at that time. Mm-hmm. And it was after we had adopted Dusty and Daphne, it was 3 years later that we got a phone call that they were doing what they call a staffing. They had this one real problem. And that turned out to be the little Mexican boy.
Oh, Puerto man. Rican.
Well,
Puerto Rican, he swears.
He pleaded me in on that. And I'm kind of jumping ahead there, but after we had adopted him, he was considered the toughest case in the system. Mm-hmm.
In El Paso
County. Yeah. And anyway, after we had adopted him, he got angry at me one time. He said, "Why did you adopt me? Why did you adopt me?" I said, "You really want to know?" And he said, "Yeah, I really want to know." I said, "Well, I never learned to speak Spanish, and I wanted a little Mexican son that could teach me Spanish." And
let's hear some Spanish.
I can't tell you I won't say what he said, but he said, "F you.
Yeah.
I'm not Mexican. I'm Puerto Rican, and I don't speak any Spanish."
There you go. Oh, man.
He was funny. When we did Daphne and Dusty, and the day came that we could take them out of there, he stood, and the look on his face, this little, I call him my brown baby, and he just broke my heart. He started crying. His two best buds were leaving, and that was that. And it was a happy time, but I cried all the way home. I could not stop thinking about him too. And to me, I didn't understand why we just couldn't take the three of them, but that's the law, right. The Department of Human Services. So I tracked him for 3 years. We set up Hope and Home. I started working at Hope and Home, helping with foster adopt classes, Catholic Charities, Lutheran Family Services, the Department of Human Services, and Hope and Home would get together and offer the foster adopt classes, 3 times a year or something like that. And having just been through the process, I was very aware of some of the things we needed to know that we didn't know. It was like too much training for 2 days, 2.5 days, not enough training. But when AJ, so I tracked AJ everywhere he went, and just went from bad to worse. And he ended up back in the mental hospital, and things were looking pretty bleak. He was called reactive attachment disorder, and it was bad. And Dr. Cresswell said, "You cannot take him until we do the therapeutic work with him because he's too dangerous."
What is reactive attachment disorder?
It's when a child doesn't bond, and so they don't have empathy, they don't have cause and effect, they don't have a conscience. They end up in the prison system. Yeah. They kill without remorse.
Probably caused by?
Usually in the first year of life, when a child is born, in that first year, a baby cries, and in a healthy family, mom goes to see, why is the baby crying? Is it hungry? Does it need its diaper changed? Is it feeling upset, stomach ache, whatever? And it gets comforted, and mom's trying to figure it out. with reactive attachment babies, mom slaps the baby to tell it to shut up, slaps it.
Okay.
And so they're deprived of emotion, empathy. They're deprived of the healing touch. One of the drugs is the release that our brain and our heart work together to release is from touch. Serotonin, it's from touch and good feelings. So these babies don't have that. So when they get to be 1, so they're lacking now. They're a rage that builds up inside. But as a baby, they don't know what the rage, it's just this rage that's building because needs are not met. Then from 1 to 2 years old, it's when a child learns boundaries. So they're starting to crawl, they're starting to walk. In a normal home, if they reach for a hot coffee cup, mom or dad takes it, says hot, and takes it away. They have no boundaries. Nobody cares. They can do whatever they want. So now you don't have cause and effect hasn't formed right. So they don't have a conscience. You have all these problems.
Okay.
So examples of a reactive attachment. The best one is Helen Keller, the movie Miracle Worker. Fabulous. It shows how you deal with that.
Yeah.
That's the greatest. And so you can see what happened to her with the right therapy. She becomes a very empathetic person. She wants to help others. Everything turns outward.
I see.
Saddam Hussein was a reactive attachment. Everything's inward. He kills. He has no remorse, nothing. So you have those through history, pictures of those. But it's really hard, the foster care system, because they have a child for a short period of time, or, they're trying to stabilize it. But how can you stabilize it when they've lost so much and been through so much? And then a family rejects it and it moves to the next and it moves to the next.
Right.
So it's constant rejection.
You're trying to stabilize something that was never even solidified.
Yes, exactly. So now you have a real problem. So medication is how they try to address that, just to get them to function in society or hopefully in a family. So AJ was on some pretty heavy duty stuff. So the heavy therapy was done by Dr. Walter Merrick. He works with reactive attachment. He flies around the country. He's phenomenal. So he did the therapy with a therapeutic foster family. That was fantastic, and got AJ to the point then when we could incorporate him into our family. And I knew he was our son. I'm AJ, he's AJ. He had a tummy like Papa's. I'm part Mexican. He's my brown baby.
Yeah.
So this is my child.
So tell me about the first time or some of the early days he interacted with horses.
Oh, that was awesome.
I'm sure. I want to hear about it.
We had my old saddle horse. His registered quarter horse name was Ole Sauerkraut.
Okay.
And this horse was phenomenal. He was a equine therapy horse to the max, just the way he was. And he taught all of our children to ride. And the best way is tell you a story about AJ. We had adopted AJ, and he'd been on a horse maybe 5 times in his life. And I'd gotten a phone call from the then congressman of the 5th District, Joel Heffley. And Joel Heffley called and said, hey, we have the American Quarter Horse Association trail ride up at Castle Rock, and there's going to be about 300, 400 people there. And I've got some guests coming. And he said, we need about 10 horses. And I said, okay, I can load them and bring them. And so we had adopted AJ, and I was going to take AJ with me and put him on a horse, and we're going to go on this all-day trail ride out on a ranch outside of Castle Rock, Colorado. And we get there, and these people are gathering from all over the United States for this big all-day trail ride. And Joel comes up to me, or I guess I should be polite. He says, I never give him enough courtesy, so I'll call him Congressman Heffley in case he ever listens to this.
Yeah.
But anyway, Joel comes up to me, and he's all Billy Jack. He said, I miscounted. We're one horse short. And I told Joel, I said, that's no problem. I said, I'll tell you what, y'all go ahead and go, except you and Lynn take AJ with y'all, and I'll put him on Ole Sauerkraut, and he just tag along with y'all. He said, oh, no. He said, I'm the one that miscounted. You go, and I'll set it out. And I says, no, I don't plan on setting it out. And I said, with this many people, somebody's going to get bucked off, and there's going to horse come back to camp riderless, and I'll catch the horse and I'll catch up on it. Mm-hmm. So sure enough, the trail ride left, and AJ was riding off with Congressman Joel Heffley and his wife Lynn and their group of people, and they go off over the hill. And I'm sitting there at the camp with some of the camp crew and the lunch crew getting ready to take the lunch out for the lunch break. And sure enough, here comes this beautiful big Palomino running over the hill with its mane a-flying and the tail a-flying. And I thought, oh, here comes my horse. And so I catch the horse, and then I'm standing there holding the horse, and here comes a golf cart with this rather large lady on the back. And she's crying and a boo-hooing and a bawling. She's come all the way from Texas or Oklahoma to go on the trail ride, and she got dumped off this horse, and she has all these reasons for why the horse must have spooked or whatever, mm-hmm. but she's afraid to get on the horse. So I tell the lady, I said, well, let me go ahead, and I said, so the horse doesn't pick up a bad habit, why don't you ride with the camp crew to the lunch break, and I'll ride your horse so it doesn't pick up any bad habits and think it can dump the rider and quit for the day. And so I get on the horse, and I go, and with several hundred people, I don't find AJ and the group. And so at lunch break, I finally catch up with them. And the lady comes up to me and said, oh, will you please ride my horse? I don't want to ride my horse. I said, good, got a deal. So anyway, they had set up on the afternoon trail ride. They found the most rugged part of the terrain on the ranch. It had ponds and creeks and bogs and pretty steep. And they had this professional horseman that had a loudspeaker, and he was going to give a class on how to ride through really difficult terrain and how to properly cross a bog and how to cross a creek and how to go up and down a steep hill and go, and so he was going to give a little seminar. And so as he took off, talking to the crowd that had gathered up around on the hill listening, I looked, and here's AJ on Sauerkraut right behind him. And so I looked over at Joel and Lynn, and they were laughing because the guy's saying to the crowd, oh, look at this little cowboy. You can tell he's ranch raised. He knows what he's doing. Son, you just go ahead and keep following me as long as you can. But the thing was that Joel and Lynn knew that that's only the fifth or sixth time he'd been on a horse in his life. But he had all of our children, I would say, really bonded with that horse. And that horse actually did a better job, I think, crossing the bogs and the creek than the professional. Yeah. And but there again, that experience gave AJ esteem. And so I would have to say that our children really enjoyed the time that they had with horses, and it gave them an identity that they were somebody special. And that was a beautiful part of my job at the Airforce Academy. The kids could go to work with me out there as much as they could, and they all had horses to ride, and they spent time out there horseback. And then the staff that I had out there, Jeanne Springer and the team at the Airforce Academy, they were always around, and they had eyes out, and they knew what was going on. But
I think too, the freedom that they were given from having been everything so defined and locked in, a facility, and then and AJ would put on his, I don't ever know how he got that, probably from Young Marines, his little Army uniform, his camis, and I would look out, and he'd be on Sauerkraut bareback with his BB gun, and he was the big, and he would be playing around, and Sauerkraut would get tired of it and go under a tree and knock him off. It never bothered him, but the kids had a sense of accomplishment. They had their animal. They could go talk to it. They could go whatever. It was their animal. They cared for it. And so I think it was a sense of freedom. Yeah. And AJ had gone from realizing, and all of them, he realized it the fastest, that this was his family. We did a trust exercise. Boy, I'll tell you, that's when you sweat and hope that you did the right thing, because I was homeschooling, and I noticed that trust was still an issue with our oldest son, Dusty. And I thought, okay, here's a really great trust exercise. I'm going to stand behind you and I want you to fall back and I'm going to catch you. I'm right here. And AJ was the first to go. He was a little chunky, stout thing. And he didn't even hesitate. He fell backwards. He knew I would catch him. And at that time, I'm thinking, oh, Lord, don't let me drop him. And I caught him. But I realized with each of the kids that some of them were more comfortable if they could see my hands, if they were back close and I could. And then it was where Dusty couldn't hardly do it unless I was up against him. Okay. And then I realized I needed to address some issues with him, which worked out beautifully. But the trust, keeping your word, listening to them. Kids know if somebody's, blown smoke. Yeah. They want honesty. And that honesty was based on their ability to understand, at the time. But AJ never looked back. He never thought back of, I want to find my birth parents. With all of the kids, I had told them, when you're old enough, if, once you get to that age, because it could not be what you want. If you want to find your birth parents, I'll help you find your birth parents. It's okay. Yeah. You can have it all. It's fine. But there was never this was his family. And he got to the point where if I stubbed my toe, he cried out in pain. So the empathy that through this reactive attachment therapy that was done was amazing. Wow. To this day, he adopts dogs that are the weirdest looking things that nobody wants. Right. Legs crooked, bumps all over him. He doesn't care. Mm-hmm. He told me, he said, when he grew up, he said, Mom, I know God made me to protect and serve. Wow. And I'm going, yeah, he did. They all have empathy, but I think for AJ, it was the biggest shift because he was so far the other way.
Mount Carmel Veteran Service Center and the Veterans Voice podcast are partnered with Colorado Computer Support IT Pros to handle all of our computing and technology needs. They are veteran-owned, and they're your team for innovative, collaborative IT services and solutions to enhance and support your Colorado business. Here on the show, we talk a lot about business and entrepreneurship. As businesses grow, it's inevitable that you need to outsource IT services. When that time comes for your business, consider Colorado Computer Support IT Pros.
I wanted to ask you, I'm getting like this little niche in life. I just really enjoy hearing about other people's passions. And I understand you're very passionate about dressage. Is that how you pronounce that?
Yes.
Dressage.
Yes.
Tell me a little bit about it because I had to look it up before this interview. So tell me about your history with it, how you got into it. I know you worked in Germany, Canada with the U.S. Olympic teams. You've won bronze medals, gold medals.
Oh, no, I haven't done all that.
Well, you've helped in the process of earning them.
I didn't know what it was either. And I saw it in Alaska one day. A friend of mine and this German guy Otto Semite, I'll never forget his name, was working with him with his horse. And I thought, that looks like dancing. Mm-hmm. That is so cool. And I'm just the bareback girl. I get on and I go hellbent for leather bareback. Mm-hmm. Wow, that is so neat. But I tell people that dressage is to riding what ballet is to dance. It's a form of dancing on horseback. So it's an Olympic sport. It's been around for a long, long time. The Germans have always excelled at it. Now other countries, England is doing beautifully. Denmark, it's a wide variety now. Horses are being bred specifically for it. But it is training dressage means training. Mm-hmm. It's a French word. And so it takes years to develop the horse because it's very physically demanding. It takes years to develop the rider, culminating in the Olympic level of competition. And I loved it. I loved the training part of it. I wasn't going to Meredith Manor to be a dressage rider. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ride cutting horses and reining horses. And I got there and I saw Kay Meredith riding dressage. And she decided that I had what it took, and I became her little shadow. And she trained me up and she put me on her horses and she taught me so much. And I met people that I read about in books. I went to Germany. It was amazing. But I think that I look back at it now, that God was preparing me to take on these children. Because the horses, for the most part, I was married at the time, and male dressage riders tend to be considered the professionals in the industry. That includes Germany. They train and the women ride. So the person I was married to at that time got the really good horses. I took the problem ones, and I loved it. I just loved it. And so I think God was preparing me this whole time to take on the children. I miss it. I dream about it. I watch it periodically. I keep an eye on the industry and so forth. But I wouldn't trade what I'm doing to go back to that at all. I think that he uses God, and I say he, I'm talking about our Lord. He uses all kinds of things to teach us how to help others, how to use what he's given us to help others. And to be married to someone of the like mind, the same goals, the same desires to help people, and is wonderful, because it becomes more of a team, both with the children and then with other people that come into our lives. This has been attributed to C.S. Lewis, but he was not the one who said it first. We are not a body with a soul. We are a soul with a body. So for us, working with traumatized people, it's regaining in their soul what's been damaged, what's been hurt, what's been taken away, and filling back in that which God wants them to have, which is understanding who they are and the value they have, that there is a purpose. And it doesn't matter if you're a quadriplegic. I've seen amazing things happen from a young man who has no arms and legs, was born that way. And he is one of the most dynamic speakers. I mean, it to put back in, which has been so damaged. And I think you talked about the difference between Afghanistan, Iraq, and then looking at Vietnam. I think what is being encountered by our warriors today in Afghanistan and Iraq is a culture so anti-Christian. Even though you may say you're not a Christian, in this country, we're raised with Judeo-Christian values of honoring one another, of taking care of the weak and the vulnerable, not taking advantage. I mean, this is just brought into us, especially, I think, most young men in the military. That's your job, is to protect, take care of, to defend. And so when you encounter a culture that doesn't have those values, it is horrific. And both of my boys encountered that, and it haunted them. And AJ had to go through Remount because it was just tearing him apart. Here's a man who started out as a little terrorist and became a man of God. And then he sees what's happened over there and experiences what's happened to women and to children. And and not being able to interfere. That was the hardest part, to say, Mom, we had to drive past and not interfere. Yeah. And so I think that's one of the biggest problems with our warriors coming back, is the scars that are being left from encountering evil face on. Yeah. Head on.
We go over there and experience a lot of moral dissonance. Like, we see what's going on over there. We wish we could do something about it, but we have to somehow just belly it and understand that this is their culture. We're here for a different reason. That's a part of the war that a lot of people don't talk about, like PTSD. I was in firefights, saw, blood and guts, things like that. But just going over there and experiencing such a drastically different culture, and then, like you saying, AJ, not being able to do anything about it, it hurts your heart.
It hurts your heart, and it scars. And then there's an anger at God. I mean, AJ was, and Dusty too, I mean, angry. Why is God letting this happen? And I said, he sent you over there. He's doing something about it. But that's what's going on in the world.
Yeah. It's tough to talk about, but yeah.
And we don't, with the warriors, it's not something that we bring up about their relationship with God until they bring it up. I mean, there's too much trauma. There's too much anger, tremendous amount of anger. There's a tremendous amount of shame. And so that's not something that you broach. It comes in stages. But we are always open, when somebody wants to talk about it. They're ready to then really to listen and hear. And
hearing you talk, I can tell you've interacted with many, many veterans and have helped a lot of them probably open their eyes and recover and heal. So I just want to thank you on behalf of the veteran community for the work you guys are both doing. But these have been some really inspirational stories.
Okay.
Where's AJ today?
Oh, my baby, my brown baby.
Yeah.
He used to call me from Afghanistan and say, "Mama, this is your brown baby." He lives in Colorado Springs,
Okay,
and he
cool.
has a wife, a wonderful woman, and 3 children that are just amazing. So he's
That's awesome. What a
he's
recovery
doing well.
story, man.
Yeah.
His son is in the 8th grade at Genital Junior High School, and he won this big competition. What's he, 14 years old, flying drones.
Wow.
And so he's going to represent this region in California in some drone flying competition.
There you go.
And so anyway,
Technology's
he's way
progressing.
too smart for me.
Yeah. Wow.
But
Yeah.
Well, I asked her about dressage. Let me hear about your Kentucky Derby winning horse, if you
Well,
want to get into it.
I'm just on the wings of that.
Yeah.
But there again, what Anne was talking about, neither one of us wound up on the path that we had envisioned for our lives.
Mhm.
And my passion was always been, I couldn't get a horse too fast, but I mean, just just good horses and rodeo crowd, that bunch. And a friend of mine, Mark Allen, he's rodeo cowboy and he quite a character, but he wound up with this horse, Mind That Bird, and that horse was and actually what was interesting is that horse was, I want to call him an unsung hero of that, and so the veterans really connect with that horse because that horse did phenomenal things that just shocked everybody. But in 2009, that was 135th Kentucky Derby. And for the non-horse people, there are 20 horses a year running the Kentucky Derby. And that was 135th Derby, so that's roughly 700 horses have been in the Derby. And Mind That Bird was the horse's name. And when he went to starting gates, he was the second longest shot. So he was like the 699th least expected to win.
Really?
And he just pulled a major upset. And everything was kind of against him. I mean, he's a little brown nondescript horse out of New Mexico and running against the best horses in the world.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the horses were flown in private jets, and the sheiks had the horses and the connections, and here were these cowboys from New Mexico showed up with their little horse. And anyway, that horse, Mind That Bird, is the official mascot for the Remount Foundation. Mark brought the horse up to the Airforce Academy, and we've ridden him on trail rides there. A lot of the Remount family alumni have been able to sit on the horse and get their picture taken. We took him to a home football game there at the Airforce Academy.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just that God has opened up so many avenues for us to meet so many veterans. And there are a lot of veterans that they come out here now that I'm here at the ranch, but they come out here to talk. But I guess, I don't know how to describe it, but a lot of veterans that come out and talk, after a while they say, well, I need help. And that it just kind of opens the door.
It's like it's easier to come and visit with a cowboy first and then take the step to get into the program. It's non-threatening. And we've had them out here digging in the dirt, planting flowers at my pond. I watched them with such care plant. They love it. And there's something too, when you dig in dirt, there's a chemical that's released from the dirt that's a feel-good thing. And I've watched them do that. We've sat and talked while we were varnishing wood, staining wood. This is almost like the first step to know it's okay, and there's not going to be any judgmentalism. There's not going to be it'll be very easy.
Right.
And if they come with kids, I take the kids next door and we bake cookies. We do something different.
Yeah.
So it's and sometimes they don't go through the equine assisted learning. Sometimes we go up into the mountains. We did that, a trail ride for 9 days with one of them. 3 of us up there. And so there's different ways to accommodate the need.
Okay.
Now, one of the things Bill didn't mention, and I think is very important, equine assisted learning was so important that the top mental health professional in the German military applied to be an exchange officer with the Airforce Academy to train at the Equestrian Center at Remount to take it back to Germany. He had horses himself, he and his wife, and knew how much it relaxed and they enjoyed it. And then he saw 2 of his soldiers were coming in and they were getting better. And he said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "We're working with horses." And he went, "Well, of course, I know how that feels." So his Pentagon applied to our Pentagon and got permission for him. And usually when you have an exchange officer at the Air Force Academy, they go up on the hill to teach the cadets, but he didn't. He wanted to train down with the equine therapy. So he came down and was here for a year. At the end of that year, the German Surgeon General, General Baumgartner, came over with 2 of his doctors and his aide, and he wanted to see hands-on. Alex Varn had been sending reports back to the Surgeon General. Well, he wanted to see firsthand. So he came to the Equestrian Center at the Academy, Air Force Academy, and we put him through the beginning stages of catch a horse and groom it, which was very interesting because his aides were arguing, his aide and the 2 doctors were arguing over who would catch the horse for the general. And he said, "Oh, no. He has to catch his own."
Yeah.
And so he did. And when it got done, and part of it is standing around and then discussing something that surprised you, that you hadn't anticipated in doing this exercise. And he said, first of all, he said, "Yeah, it was good." And Jeanne Springer is awesome.
I like your accent.
She's so good. She says, "Oh, sir, that's not going to work here."
Yeah.
Yeah, good doesn't work.
Yeah.
So tell me. But he said that when he was a boy, his family raised bulls. And for a moment, he was a child again in Germany with the bulls.
Okay.
And he just forgot about all of the stuff that was going on that he had to do. And then we had a barbecue. So it was a really neat thing. But based on that interaction with him, then there's a satellite program now in Germany.
That's what I was going to say. So today there's a Remount Foundation in Germany.
Yes.
Beautiful. So inspirational, you guys. I want to ask you some just like generic life wisdom type advice. I feel like I'm not a father myself, but I just feel like, excuse me, there's an issue with like younger generations finding purpose. I don't know if it has to do with technology or cell phones or video games or what it is, but there's an issue with younger generations finding purpose. I worry about how that generation progresses into the future. So what advice would you have for maybe a veteran who has younger kids, or just for younger kids, maybe teenagers in general, to find purpose, the importance of community, building that relationship with others, with like-minded people, just very generic terms like that, but just the importance behind it all and what it would mean long-term later in life?
It's a very simple question.
Yeah.
What's your passion?
Right. Find your passion.
And with our children, Anne came with 2. We had 2 more, then we adopted 5 more. Then we had some others that we took in. And so to keep from just running ragged, we talked to each child, and whatever their passion was, we would try to pursue helping that child with their passion.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that's the key thing, is their passion. And one of the things that we did when the Extreme Makeover built this house 20 years ago, we told them we don't want televisions upstairs in the bedrooms.
Yep.
No
And
video games.
No video games. And then the kids each had their responsibility. And that time we had all the chicken pens, and we had the livestock, and they all had their chores to do. But what was really interesting, is that the children, if they were having a tough day, a lot of times they just go out to the corral.
Yeah.
They'd be out there with the animals.
And some kids, if you ask them what's your passion, they go, I don't know.
Right.
I said, okay, let's start thinking about it.
Yeah, let's think about it.
Yeah. You like to draw? Do you like to sing? Do you like to dance? Do you like, and just whatever goes, oh, yeah, I kind of like that. Well, then pursue it. If it changes, it changes. It's okay to change.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's huge. If they know that there's something that they can be interested in, that you're going to encourage them in. They get a sense of accomplishment. Our boys wanted to do Young Marines, and that's every Saturday morning for, 3 or 4 hours at Fort Carson. And so it was like, okay, Young Marines it is, and off we'd go. And the commander of it was wonderful because they had to do PT, and they had to do tests, and they had to do this, and they had to do that. But he always ended it with sitting and telling them stories about special operations or things. And I mean, they were just riveted to his stories. And so our oldest son, when he went into Young Marines, he said, I want to be the top recruit. I said, okay, what's it going to take? And he lined out what it was going to take. And I said, okay, let's do it. And he did it. That is the only time that he set his goals on something like that and went all the way and achieved it. And so later on in life, I'd say to him, I told him, I said, Dusty, do you remember that boy that set the goals and went for it? I said, he's still there. Just find him. So I think that, and one of the things that Dr. Cresswell told me was very important. He said, and it happens in not just in adoptive families, it happens in birth families where you have a kid that blows out at 18. They go, I'm out of here. I'm 18, you can't stop me on my own. And he said, let him go. You don't fight to keep him. Let him go. That's when you pray and God takes over, and you always keep the door open. And so that's what we had to do, because a couple of our kids went back into the darkness, but they were given the tools. If you give children the tools when they're young, then you have to expect that they'll use those tools later. And that's what a couple of ours had to learn was, we're not going to rescue you this time. You can rescue yourself.
I like that. Yeah, finding passion, and when you don't know, you just have to think about it.
Yeah,
It's that easy. And then it could be as simple as drawing, but how does drawing progress from a 5-year-old to a college student? Wow, you're an architect. You're
Oh,
studying engineering.
Yeah.
That went from like connecting the dots as a young age, and now you're designing buildings. Like we need to instill these passions really young in life, and then just watch them progress.
And expect them to understand that. I think our education system dummies down our kids too much. And to expect them to take responsibility and expect that they have a brain and talk to them like they have a brain. Sometimes kids don't deserve answers. I swore I'd never say because I said so.
Yeah.
I grew up with that. But there is times when that is appropriate.
Yeah.
But then there's times when they do deserve to have some discussion and explanation.
Yeah.
So as a parent, you kind of have to weigh those. And
I like saying enabling rather than coddling.
Mm-hmm.
Can you enable your kids to do something rather than coddling them and shying them away from the dangers of life?
Right.
Enable them to handle it.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, the first time they come off a horse, you go, they're going to come off. You try to make sure it happens on soft ground or, not when they're being real, real crazy, but that's part of the learning process.
Well, let's wrap up, but tell me what building we're sitting in right now. We have to cover it. Tell me about it.
Well, in 2005, the children had been watching that television show, Extreme Makeover Home Edition.
Right.
And they asked about sending off an application. I thought that'd like buying a lottery ticket. And so I just said, yeah, sure, go ahead. So they, Wendy, that was worked with the Professional Rodeo Cowboy Association, came out with their little camera, and they took pictures, and they sent off an application. And so, lo and behold, they at that time, we found out later, they were getting over 2,000 applications a day.
Wow.
They had 200 people on staff looking through applications. and somehow we made the cut.
Jeez.
And
Some odds there.
So yeah. So anyhow, the fact that Anne was homeschooling the children, she was spending more time at the school with the children, their behavior problems, that Anne had said she'd never homeschool. And so God got the last laugh there. But anyway, we had bought this place, and we had converted an old garage into a heated classroom, and that's where Anne was homeschooling the children. And Extreme Makeover Home Edition came out in 2005 and blessed us with this schoolhouse. And then as the kids were grown and gone, Anne and another veteran from our program that likes doing woodwork came out, and they converted the schoolhouse for an office. And so this is where I've been doing my remount work since retiring from the Airforce Academy in 2019. And then I stepped aside from Remount, but Ann and I are both ambassadors for Remount Foundation now. And so during COVID, we had a lot of veterans that would come out here. We work with first responders and I forget what year, but sheriff called me up and we talked, and he wanted to know if, he said, well, a lot of our law enforcement are veterans, and would they fit under your Remount umbrella? And we said, certainly. So we have meetings out here with law enforcement and firefighters and veterans.
Okay.
And so anyway, it's been a real blessing.
Yeah. Well, those odds were slim, but you guys deserved it. Absolutely. Just hearing your story today, you guys deserved that.
It's divine intervention. Mm-hmm. The odds were so great. And this has served well. I mean, we host missionaries now, and we have warriors that stay with us as they're trying to get on their feet. And it's never a dull moment. There's always stuff going on here. Yeah. And I love it that people feel comfortable stopping by. We had, I had gotten really sick before I was able to finish homeschooling the kids. So the last couple of years, the kids were at the high school. And so some of their friends would stop by that needed help, or, so it's been utilized to help others. And that was the purpose of it.
Yeah. So you actually did teach out of here for...
I did. Yes, I tell you, this was so much fun. But I had to promise Congressman Heffley that I would not do any major chemistry experiments here.
No fire hazards.
He said, I don't want to see the place on fire and you and the kids running out and making the front page of the paper.
Man.
And then my daughter had to make me promise when we were studying diseases and stuff not to grow anything infectious in our little petri dishes.
Oh, man. Well, did you guys have any closing comments maybe? This is just a platform to speak to the veteran community. So if you had any words of wisdom, life advice, inspiration, go ahead. Feel free.
There's no shame in getting help. What our warriors are experiencing is not what God intended for us to experience, and it is damaging. And there is no shame in getting help. And life is very rich once you get past the stigma of saying, I need help. We all need help.
We all need help, and we can all help each other.
Exactly. And that's what we're here for.
Yeah. I didn't tell you this. Our motto on the show is you're not alone. So you guys are just another salient example that you're not alone.
Yep.
Remount Foundation. The people could still reach out, right? Veterans today could still reach out. How would they do that?
Well, they have the Remount Foundation website, remounttfoundation.org. And then earlier, I have phone calls to respond to. Remount Foundation was founded there on the United States Air Force Academy. But there are certain limitations because it is on a government installation. So calls that I have today to respond to later, the Remount Board of Directors is looking at expanding. One of the calls came in from Texas, wanting to know if we could develop a Remount Foundation chapter in Texas. And then they're also looking at potential offsites in the area so that it'll be easier for veterans and first responders and their families to get to when they have tight security at the Air Force Academy.
Okay.
So anyway, we're really being blessed. There are what's amazing, we have great people coming to the table that said, hey, we see what y'all are doing out there and how can we help? And so sometimes those are going to be worker bees, and there are people that are saying, well, they're offering financial support.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what's going to be a real blessing, that as Remount goes forward into the future, it's tried to be positioned to last for generations to come, because there's going to be a need forever.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll put the website in the comments of the show here, the description of the show, so people, if they're interested, feel like they could benefit from it, or just want to ask some questions, they'll reach out.
Well, and if equine therapy isn't up your alley, get another one. There's animal therapies, so whatever resonates with you. There's art therapy. There's so many. Just do it.
Music.
Oh, yes.
Don't get me talking about music. We'll need another hour.
Oh.
At least. I love music. What kind of music are you guys into? I'm sure country western.
Classical, country western.
And started
honky
out.
tonk. I love
that. Her dad told me when I went and picked up Anne and the children, their dogs and their horses in California, he said 2 things. Don't bring her back, and get her a piano.
You play piano?
I used to.
Oh, beautiful.
And so 7 years later, when she was in the hospital, her parents came out, and her dad said, I saw the piano sitting in the house. Did you ever play it? And I said, nope, but you said get her a piano, so I did.
Yeah, there you go.
And he said, did she ever tell you about her piano playing? I said, no. And he said, when she was really gifted as a child and was playing classical piano. And when she was, I think, 8 years old, they were in Sri Lanka, and said she played a piano recital for the
Prime Minister
of Sri Lanka.
Wow.
And he said she played piano all the way up into college, and then she closed the piano and quit. That's well, she hadn't played it since.
Right.
So then he asked me, he said, did she ever tell you about her shooting career? And I said, no. And then he told me about her shooting career. And one of the stories he told me, that in a competition, I think he said it was law enforcement, the military, and the intercollegiate shooting team. And he said she came out right behind a Marine that had won the gold medal in the Olympics or something.
Man, we're not done. Tell me about that.
Then I'm sitting there at the hospital out there in the hospital bench, and he looked over and said, well, did she ever tell you about her softball career?
There you go.
And I said, no. And he said, well, yeah. I said, the only time Alaska sent a team to the high school national championship, she had played baseball with some big shot baseball players up there that worked. And so
Dave Kingman. And
I told him, I said, the only thing I knew about was her dressage.
Yeah, horses. Oh, man.
So, but anyway, there again, music, as Remount grows and expands, we have some top programs where they're wanting to incorporate music into the Remount, under the Remount umbrella.
Yeah.
There's such possibilities. We took a warrior that had been in Somalia during Black Hawk Down, and he had gotten out. This was in 2000 maybe. No, I don't know, 5-6 years ago, maybe. And another woman and I, we decided to go ride the Colorado Trail. We thought it would be a lot of fun. 2015. And I thought, the Colorado Trail. Okay, so then I looked it up, and it's 500 miles from Denver to Durango. I thought, oh, well, why can't we do that? So because Bill didn't want us on our own, the two of us out there, one of the warriors went with us, this fella. And it was amazingly therapeutic for him. We spent 9 days on the Colorado Trail, and it was life-changing for him. But I learned a lot. I learned about trauma a lot, and I learned about processing, and I learned about flashbacks, and it was amazing spending those 9 days with him, and the difference in him from when we started and when we finished. So I'd like to see that incorporated into Remount also.
Yeah. And the lady was a Marine colonel's wife, and he had spent a large portion of his 20 years deployed. And so anyway, Anne and the lady and the fellow went on that 9-day trail ride, and that was quite an experience.
Yeah, I'm sure. Wow. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. I appreciate you guys coming on the Veterans Voice podcast, sharing some wisdom, sharing your resources, and most importantly, sharing your story with us all. So I enjoyed it. Our listeners will enjoy it, I'm sure. And keep doing what you're doing, because you're extremely inspirational and you've helped a lot of people, and I'm sure we'll continue to help for a lot longer. So thank you guys.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for what you're doing.
Yes.
Because there's some veteran out there that hears, and I'll guarantee there have been some really tough men and women that were not ashamed to ask for help.
Right.
And that's the key right there.
Yeah. That's the whole point of the podcast. You're not alone. It's not shameful to ask for help. Here's a bunch of resources to take advantage of. So just reach out. You guys are just another one now. So thank you guys.
You're welcome.